Okay. As Tara May said, just sort of said, we're broadcasting this basically live through Zoom, which is our main broadcast medium, but we're also simulcasting it on YouTube Live because some people prefer to come in that way. Okay.
Got it.
Good.
Could we just check? I tried to bring more light in if possible, but if it's too much, I can dial it down.
What do you guys think? You're a little bit side lit. Broadcasting this basically live through.
Hold on just a second. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, that's my feedback through Tara's mics. There we go. You're a bit side lit.
Okay.
Guys, what do you think? Cooper, Nathan, Tara? Yeah.
Yep.
My screen
That
anyway.
looks good to me.
All right.
Tara, does that look all right to you? She's setting up the live stream here. How's my sound level, everybody?
You seem good.
Good, you can hear me all right? Excellent. Melanie, your sound's great.
Okay, good. I'm glad the microphone I have from my department is useful.
I brought a podcasting mic that I've been using for this kind of stuff. So
they bought like, I don't know, 5 or 6 for us for teaching. So it's been
yeah.
It bothers me, Dr. Latham, that you use the same background for the talks as class. I want some pizzazz for these talks.
Sorry.
Some glitter.
Oh, you know what? I actually we have a, damn it, I meant to get that today. We actually have like a stand-up Oklahoma Center for the Humanities thing. And I meant to bring that in from the office and put it up behind me for the talks. That would have been a good idea. I've got to remember to get that for next time. Because yeah, the background's a little boring here.
No,
Jen made me I had a lot of stuff back there, but Jen made me take it all out. She said it, my wife, she said it was distracting. So I kept the James Joyce doll though. He's still back there.
Oh yeah, we gotta have. All right. I think we're good to go. I'm going to mute myself for a second.
Okay. How's your week been going, Melanie?
Almost done. So that's good.
Good. Yeah. Do you teach tomorrow?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So it's been a difficult week because I was teaching about lynching. So.
Oh.
Yeah. Doing that remotely. It's like, there's no air.
Yeah. No kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, good. And Don James is here. Hello, Don James.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well.
Good.
I'm looking forward to this all day, and
Great.
it feels good to have finally arrived.
And as I said in the setup, but we'll just plan, Don James, basically to have you run as much of the Q&A as you feel like. I'll be there to help. And the way this will work, if you keep your chat window open, Melanie, keep yours closed. I mean, you can have it open if you want, but it's just a distraction
closed.
Unless you want it. Yeah. But I'll encourage people at the very start of the talk to interact as much as they wish to during the talk. And then the 2 students that are here, Cooper and Nathan, will be sort of keeping an eye on that. And if there are a ton of questions and we need to consolidate them, they'll do that. If not, they'll just make sure that they're there to be asked as well.
Cool.
And I may step in to help pick up some questions or whatever it might be.
Sounds good.
But basically, Don James, I'll as the talk ends, I'll sort of say thank you and then briefly introduce you to say you're going to help run the Q&A as an expert in the health humanities that we have on our faculty here, and that it was your idea to bring Melanie, and that you'll be helping us run the Q&A portion. And you may need to, in my experience, you'll need to fill a bit of time with your own questions, and then the chat questions will start in. So just be prepared for that.
Could we test the? Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying I have some good questions. So.
I hope I have answers. Could we test the screen share real quick just to make sure?
And you should have screen control. Do you have the button there to do it?
I see that. So I just have a couple things that I want to.
I'm seeing it just fine. Looks
Great.
really good, actually.
Perfect. And then I wonder if I pause it, does that take it off entirely, or do I need to stop it?
Looks like you may need to stop it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm still seeing it anyway.
Oh, well, that's annoying. Okay, good to know. I haven't done that during class yet, so.
There we go.
Great.
And when you're talking, Don James, I'd suggest this for you too. I'm going to turn, if you don't, I'm just going to turn my camera off. So I'll switch over to a picture of myself. just so that people aren't watching me fidget.
Got it. During the talk. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'll turn it back on right as you're nearing the end.
Cool.
But don't worry, I haven't wandered away or anything.
Okay. Yeah.
I even, just in case, like I'm actually wearing pants. Like
Me
this is
too.
this is a formal occasion, man.
Look at that.
Totally. It's funny because I wear shorts while I teach, definitely. So I like look relatively formal from the waist up and like a slob from the waist down. But tonight I also wore pants. I don't know why.
So see, this is
You
all
had
three
been
of us.
looking forward to this. Look at that. Mark of enthusiasm.
Exactly. I love your jacket.
Thank you.
I saw a funny thing on Twitter today of a woman who's like, well, I just got divorced in my shorts. Like she was dressed up like from the top up and then took a picture of herself like in divorce proceedings in court.
Right.
That's really funny.
I
The
know my
things we
daughter's
can do now.
Yeah.
said the same thing. She works for a law firm and part-time, and she said they're all like waist down like shorts and then like just part of a three-piece suit up top.
Yeah. It does really kind of underline how many of your clothes are not for you.
True. That is true. I think they're for me when I'm not in a pandemic, but you're right.
Right.
But then when the true test comes, they just stay in the closet.
Yeah, I miss things like I'm proud of my collection of Adidas footwear that I wear to class as like the lame attempt to be a cool professor. And like my shoes all still look brand new, like a year on. They've barely been touched, you know?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's nice. It feels like I'm going to the shoe store every time the few times I go to campus. I'm like, wow, I have a whole collection to choose from that are all in pristine shape. Right. I don't know. I meant to check with Tara how many people we actually had registered for this, so I don't know, but I guess we'll find out. We've been doing about 45 plus, I think, for the ones we've done so far. I would expect something similar for this evening. And they all
notifications are off.
Okay, good. Yeah.
You
And they'll
know.
all come pouring in at the last minute. So we'll admit them right at 7, and then I'll start my introductions as people continue to come in, because I've got slightly lengthy ones tonight. I'm just going to say something about, in addition to introducing you, I've just got some words to say about the Humanities Center, some upcoming events and stuff as well.
All right.
And Tara, do you have those links ready to go that I mentioned to you earlier?
I did. Melanie, do you prefer, if I link to your book, Smell Detectives, do you prefer that I link to the press page or to Amazon, or do you have a preference?
I think the right thing to do is the press page,
Yeah.
even though
I kind of
probably
thought so.
the easier thing for everyone is Amazon, but
Yeah, I kind of thought so. You know, Sean, or you could just mention, oh, it's also available on Amazon, but I'll share the press.
I think everywhere books are sold.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and just to answer your question, we had about 40 people register, so
Great. Okay.
That's pretty good.
all right.
Yep,
And
right
we,
about what we're expecting. And we'll get some that'll come in at the last minute because they have the invitation, but haven't done the registration piece yet.
That's usually me.
I see my wife has actually jumped on even earlier.
yeah, she was on before you were.
Yeah, wow.
I felt awkward not admitting her into the room.
Oh, we're not letting the riffraff in.
Yeah.
Standards.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself again and just give me the go ahead when you want me to admit everyone, Sean.
Okay, sounds good. And Melanie, just to make sure I have this down right, it's Kiechle, right? I don't want to
Yeah, Kiechle,
mispronounce
you got
that.
it.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Terrific. All right. So I think we're basically right at 7 here. Tara, why don't you go ahead and start clicking the admit buttons here, and we'll start letting people in.
I'll see you soon.
All right.
Bye. I mean, I'm staying, but I'm turning off my video.
All right. Hello, everyone. As you're filtering in, welcome to the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. It's a pleasure to have you here this evening. We're going to wait just a minute. It takes a little bit. It's a little bit of a process to admit everybody to the room. So I'm going to ask you to bear with us for just a minute or two while we go through the process of admitting everybody and getting your audio working and so on. But we're glad that you could join us for tonight's event on women's health testimony and history with Melanie Kiechle. As you come in, you'll hear that your mics are being muted as you come into the room, and I'll say something more about that in a moment. But you should be able to get audio from myself and from the speaker this evening. And you may find it easier as you're joining the room, if you're not familiar with Zoom, to click on speaker view at the top right. It'll make tonight's talk fill your screen rather than getting a kind of Hollywood Squares effect of everyone joining the meeting at once. Okay. All right, so I think we'll go ahead and get going. I'm going to go ahead and begin my introductory remarks while we continue to bring more and more of you into this evening's talk. For those who don't know, my name is Sean Latham. I'm the Pauline McFarland Walter Professor of English here at the University of Tulsa and the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, which is the host for this evening's event. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all here virtually. I, of course, wish we could be welcoming you to University of Tulsa's beautiful campus and to Adelson Auditorium in Tyrrell Hall, where we customarily host these events. But we're absolutely delighted that you're taking the time and energy that's required in these stressful days to join us for one of these events. Before we get going, I want to say just a couple of words about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, about what we do, and a little bit about some of our upcoming events as well. So we essentially have two missions at the Humanities Center, the first of which is to select an idea, a topic, or a theme that we think can only be fully and richly engaged using the distinctive tools of the arts and humanities. And these are ideas that we believe have potent and important impacts on our day-to-day lives as citizens and as members of our community. Throughout this academic year of 2020-2021, we're actually focusing on a pair of interlinked themes: courage on the one hand and rage on the other. And tonight's event will be focusing in particular on the theme of courage. To support this work, we undertake a variety of different activities. The first of which is to bring together a group of faculty members here on the University of Tulsa campus, of members of the larger community, and of students. And they work together in intensive seminars throughout the course of the year on each of these themes, creating essentially two think tanks that are working alongside us throughout the year. And I'll say more about one of those seminars here in just a moment. And in addition, we host between 30 and 35 public programs like the one you're joining us for this evening that also explore these themes in a variety of different ways. I'll say some more in just a moment about our upcoming themes, but I thought it would be interesting tonight to just briefly introduce you to the members of that Courage seminar. So this is a group, as I said, made up of faculty, students, and experts from the community who are all coming together, meeting regularly, and exploring this topic of courage from a broad, interdisciplinary set of perspectives. And I think you'll hear that in the people I introduce. So we have three faculty members from the University of Tulsa involved in this seminar. They're Jeff Alderman from our Oxley College of Health Sciences, Ayla Haas from our College of Law, and Don James McLaughlin from the Department of English and the College of Arts and Sciences, who will actually be helping me this evening. Our two public fellows are Cindy Berkowitz, who's a high school teacher in the Tulsa Public School System, and Jessica Harvey, who's a Tulsa Artist Fellow here in the city. And we're joined as well by three students, Ritvik Ganguly, Liza Williams, and Jasmine Johnson. And as often the case with students today, and especially with students at the University of Tulsa, they are bringing together a whole array of different sets of expertise and studies. So we have students that are doing pre-med and chemical engineering, Spanish and sociology and African-American studies. So I just want to make you aware of this group. You'll be able to find interviews with them on our website at humanities.utulsa.edu and learn more about their background and the expertise that they're bringing to this seminar. Now, I also want to look ahead to some of the events that we have coming up at the Humanities Center. So next week on the 15th of October at 7 o'clock, that's exactly a week from tonight, we'll be joined by Nick Estes, who's a Native American scholar and a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. And he's written a book called Our History as the Future, about the history of indigenous resistance movements in the United States and the ways in which they've helped model all kinds of activities that have become part of civil disobedience throughout the history of the United States. On the 29th of October, we're going to take a week off in there actually for homecoming at TU. And then on the 29th of October, we'll be joined for a panel discussion called All the Rage that will be led by Professor Zinnia Kish here from the University of Tulsa. And it will be exploring how social media has helped fuel white rage, in particular in internet chat rooms, Facebook, and other forms of social media. And on November 7th, we'll be joined by Dr. Chan Hellman from the University of Oklahoma, who's an expert on hope, and he'll be delivering a talk called Hope in the Times of Trauma. And you may well have divined, if you're looking at your calendars, that event will take place 2 days after the United States election for president. So that's not exactly an accident. We're trying to engage with what we know is going to be a difficult and tumultuous time, a time that calls for the kind of work and expertise, as I said, that the humanities can bring. So to learn more about our work, to stay engaged with what we're doing at the center, to learn about our events and to get some background reading and interviews that connect to all of the events that we host, I urge you to visit our website at humanities.utulsa.edu. And there you can also subscribe to our newsletter, which goes out once a month and provides a calendar of events and other background material. And then, of course, on our website, you can find social media links and more. And we'll provide links to our website. Actually, if you keep an eye on the chat here, you'll see a link to that appear in just a moment. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Melanie Kiechle for this evening's talk. As our plans for this semester took shape, we know that this Courage seminar in particular would present a unique opportunity to explore the emerging field that works at the intersection of health and the medical humanities. This is a moment, after all, when medical professionals, for example, are being asked to demonstrate enormous courage in our long global struggle with COVID. And we too are being asked to think about what it means to face this moment courageously. Right? Sometimes these are small acts like wearing a mask, even though it might be uncomfortable, by distancing ourselves even from loved ones and in times of celebration and mourning, so that we don't put them at risk, and perhaps even risking conflict with others as we encourage them to undertake similar sacrifices. Tonight's speaker will focus on a similar kind of courage by looking at the way that women in particular in the 19th century struggled to make their voices heard in debates about public health. Dr. Kiechle is an associate professor in the Department of History at Virginia Tech University and the author of a book called The Smell Detectives, which you'll find a link to in the chat here as well, which explores the ways in which doctors, citizens, and public health officials use their noses to understand the spread of disease in late 19th century America. At the time, foul odors were believed to cause illness, and in an uncanny parallel with our own moment, the era of crowded urban spaces seemed to be filled with invisible and invasive threats. Indeed, as she told me in preparing for the talk tonight, she is, among other things, an expert on historic ventilation systems. So hopefully we can learn something from the past to apply to our present moment. And that's certainly a topic we may well want to visit in the question and answer session that will follow tonight's presentation. So as I said, as you were coming into the session tonight, I just want to remind you that all of your mics are on mute and they'll remain that way so that we can protect against Zoom bombs. But I want to encourage all of you to engage early and often with the talk in the chat. It's there for you to participate. Your name will appear alongside every comment that you make. And we urge you to ask questions as they occur to you during the course of the talk. Please don't feel like you need to save them up to the end. We'll be keeping track of those. Our moderators will be keeping track of those. We have a couple of graduate students that are working in the background to do that. So please feel free to ask questions, make points, and just post information and material in the chat as the talk progresses. That'll make the question and answer session go a good deal easier. And to help with the question and answer session tonight, I'll be joined by my colleague from the Department of English, Professor Don James McLaughlin, who's one of our Courage Fellows this year, and himself an expert on our faculty in the health humanities. In fact, he's the one that recommended Dr. Kiechle for tonight's event. So he'll be joining us to really lead us through the Q&A because he too brings unique and distinctive expertise to this topic. So with all that in mind, I want to thank you again for joining us. And now I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Kiechle for tonight's talk. Melanie, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sean. And thank you all of us for making time this evening to dip into the past. I want to get right to things. And so I'm going to start by taking all of us back to 1873, when there were very different health threats about, and when 6 women barely had the chance to testify to the Massachusetts Board of Health. One lawyer called the names of several ladies, and the secretary of the Board of Health intervened. Dr. George Derby challenged the lawyer, "What do you mean to prove by all these ladies?" The lawyer, Charles J. McIntyre, answered that the women, like the men who had just testified, were parties who had been affected by the smells. That answer seemed to satisfy the board. The chairman merely instructed McIntyre to confine the examination to the effects of the smells. So 1873 was a very different time. This was the first hearing that was held by the newly created State Board of Health, and its goal was to determine the source of a stench nuisance. In this period before germ theory explained that microscopic bacteria and viruses spread disease, as we well know today, people thought that miasmas, those were bad airs. They thought that's what caused illness. In a worldview where bad air was pestilential, it was common sense that stenches could cause disease. The residents of East Cambridge, Massachusetts, had petitioned the state board because there was a terrible stench in their neighborhood. It disturbed sleep, they argued. It also harmed the health of Boston area residents. So the public hearing, the first one that the Board of Health had, it featured lawyers for the petitioners and lawyers for the area's largest slaughterhouse, that owned by John P. Squire and Company. But the centerpiece of the hearing are the people who took the stand to explain how foul odors harmed their bodies and how they knew that those odors emanated from the slaughterhouse. Most of that story is in my book. I want to really focus on what happened to these several women, the several ladies who were called to testify. Before he called them, McIntyre had already invited 16 men to the stand who testified at great length and in considerable detail about local stenches and the physical effects they suffered from them. Men recounted being woken from a sound sleep and having to close their windows against smelly breezes. The men also discussed physical ailments, including headaches, irritated throats, nausea, and even vomiting. All of those things are symptoms that physicians today would consider as evidence of low-level respiratory distress, that there was something in the air that was bothering these people. But when the men were testifying, members from the Board of Health had very little to say. They interrupted only once in a while to ask for clarification. When women took the stand, the hearing changed. Although the 6 women who testified offered the same kinds of information as the men before them, board members interrupted frequently. They limited the scope of questions, and they curtailed the women's testimony to just a few minutes each. As the 6th woman took the stand, the board chair pointedly asked McIntyre, "Do you expect to bring out anything new by this witness?" The board was impatient when McIntyre replied that he was trying to show the cumulative effects of the odors, and especially that, quote, "some have been made seriously sick by them." The board issued more specific instructions about what could and could not be asked, and consequently, Ms. Charlotte Fogg was the 6th and the final woman to speak at that hearing. So that sets the stage for my goal this evening, which was explore what happens when women talk about their bodies and their health. The 6 women who appeared before the board, the Massachusetts Board of Health, avoided taboo topics. They did not talk in graphic terms, and they certainly did not mention their reproductive organs. Nonetheless, the men on the Board of Health, all physicians, they were clearly uncomfortable. And the lawyers that the slaughterhouse owner, John P. Squire, had hired, they were able to use the board's discomfort to their client's advantage. Rather than recognizing that the 6 women's physical experiences were consistent with those that were reported by 28 men in the course of 14 days of testimony, Squire's lawyers argued that everyone who had had negative effects from the odors were overly sensitive and even effeminate. They were like the women. The testimony of the women ultimately became a joke, and it's that common cultural reaction that I want us to better understand. Why, when women talk about their bodies and their health, do people laugh so often? What's funny? And where is the humor coming from? I'm going to explore this question with you tonight in 3 parts. We're still going to start before the Civil War in the United States with the origins of public health. And in that, we're going to pay particular attention to whether public health, as it was getting started, paid attention to women's health or not. Then we're going to return to the Massachusetts health hearings to determine what is going on, right? What is the physician's discomfort with female testimony, and how did that affect the outcome of the hearing? And I want to explain how Squire's lawyers used the very presence of women to mock and invalidate everyone else who shared similar issues. Squire's lawyers used particular terms. When they called the women overly sensitive and all men like them effeminate, what did they mean exactly? The third part of the talk is going to step away from the direct testimony to explore how men's and women's sensitivity, at least the idea of what those were, how that was changing with the rise of a powerful new medical diagnosis, the idea of neurasthenia. Neurasthenia doesn't exist today. Maybe something you've never heard before because it's a disease just of this moment. What it referred to was nervous exhaustion, the physical and mental toll that was being enacted by cultural changes. Those included urban growth, the faster industrial pace of life, and the very dangerous threat of women taking a more active role in society. So by stepping back from the Board of Health hearing and considering how ideas about health and gender were changing in American society, I hope we'll better understand what was happening in that room full of physicians, lawyers, and witnesses. How does our wider society impact health decisions? That's the question I want to direct our focus to this evening as we consider what it takes to talk publicly about health and why that conversation is so often met with laughter and derision. So the idea of public health, that health is a shared entity, it has communal dimensions, and that the government has a responsibility to act in order to protect the health of all people. That got its start in the first half of the 19th century. In both Europe and the United States, reformers argued that an individual's health could result from 2 things. There were personal causes that only affected that particular person, and then there were general causes. General causes included environmental issues such as bad air, bad water, and bad living conditions. Stenches were a problem, right? They're bad air. On both sides of the Atlantic, health reformers urged local and national governments to intervene in general causes in order to protect and improve the overall health of the populace. So public health reform, on one hand, was a humanitarian cause that aimed to improve people's lives. On the other hand, it was also an economic strategy. The goal was to prevent illness and thus lost productivity among workers. Businessmen were often also politicians, so they're the same people that public health reformers are trying to influence, and they did that by stressing the importance of their initiatives for the businessman's bottom line, right? You'll have workers who show up and who can do the job. In order to be convincing, public health reformers needed evidence, so they produced that by conducting sanitary surveys. The surveys are still in existence. We can use them today as historians of medicine. And in them, reformers were documenting both the existence of health threats and the physical suffering that those caused. So for us, the sanitary surveys are really useful because reformers wrote down all the things that they thought were affecting people's health. Health reformers did not set out to write about women's health. They were focused on the health of laborers. By the early 19th century, wage labor was culturally and ideologically defined as male. You can think of the male breadwinner bringing home the bacon. That's the image for this period. So when they talked about laborers, reformers were talking about men, and they could easily have omitted women's health as being irrelevant. But women's bodies are present in the sanitary surveys in a few different ways. The first way they show up is because reformers emphasized living conditions in the home. The same culture that made men into laborers also made women responsible for the home. A woman's unpaid job was to do the cooking and the cleaning. So when health reformers wrote about the home, they indirectly wrote about what women were doing or were not doing. Women also come up in sanitary surveys directly because they were victims of foul living conditions. When reformers were documenting the negative effects of bad air, open sewers, marshy ground, and accumulations of filth, a lot of manure in the 19th century, reformers often wrote about women. After all, women spent the majority of their time in the home, so they were the first to fall ill. Today, we'd understand that disparity as the result of exposure. Because women spent more time in the home than men, they had greater exposure to unhealthy living conditions, and thus women registered negative health effects before men did. If we go to New York City, we'll find physician John Hoskins Griscom included many ill women as evidence that cellar apartments did not get sufficient air and sunlight. Griscom, who was one of public health's most ardent and well-known advocates in the United States through the 1840s and the 1850s, he was using women as barometers of public health. Essentially, wherever Griscom found a sick woman, he identified unhealthy sanitary conditions that threatened the health of the entire city. The one wrinkle here, when we compare public health reformers to the boards that they created, is that the ill women did not testify to Griscom. Most never met him. Instead, Griscom had gotten their stories from tract missionaries, other men who were ministering to the poor in their homes. So I just want to point us to a question here that I don't have an answer to yet, which is whether reformers like Griscom listened to women or if they just trusted other men writing about women's health. In contrast, when women wrote about living conditions and about health, they trusted their own bodies and those of their friends as evidence of physical suffering. Catherine Esther Beecher was the period's most prominent domestic writer. We can think of her as the 19th century Martha Stewart, except she didn't do any ads with Snoop Dogg, and she was not worried about perfect centerpieces. Instead, Beecher wrote guidebooks telling women how to take care of the home because she had firsthand experience of the toll that poor living conditions took on women's health. So Griscom is not exactly talking to women, he's talking about women. Beecher is a woman, she's writing about women, she's writing for women. They're pretty different, but they agree, the two of them, that women were at high risk for illness because of their greater exposure. Exposure, of course, is our language today. In the 19th century, the prevailing idea was that women were the weaker sex, naturally predisposed to have poor health. Neither public health reformers nor domestic writers attacked the idea of the weaker sex, but they agreed that women's health would improve as living conditions improved. That realization falls in line with our ideas today, where we want to limit our exposure to toxins or to COVID in order to protect our own health. So in short, in this early period, because public health was framed around labor, women had a marginal place in public health at the very start. We can find women and with their health in early public health writings, but women's bodies were proxy for sanitary conditions, not being considered on their own terms. Keeping that in mind, the male labor focus of public health, I want to return to the Board of Health hearings in Massachusetts with the ones I started the talk. These hearings took place 30 years after Griscom used women's bodies as essentially canaries in the tenement, capable of revealing if the air was healthy or if it was bad. In the intervening years, attention to sanitary conditions and disease prevention had increased in American cities, especially after the Civil War and cholera struck in 1866. It was at that point that cities and states began creating permanent boards of health that were staffed by physicians who had regulatory powers over the environment. Now, these boards did not create building regulations or intervene in domestic interiors, as Catherine Beecher would have wanted, but they did take a strong stance against nuisances detrimental to health. That's a legal category of the 19th century, and it included stenches that people described as noxious or pestilential. The Massachusetts Board of Health had an especially broad stance on environmental conditions. They proclaimed all citizens have an inherent right to the enjoyment of pure and uncontaminated air and water and soil, that this right should be regarded as belonging to the whole community, and that no one should be allowed to trespass upon it by his careless or his avariceness. Concerned citizens had seized upon the board's commitment to pure air when they signed petitions against the slaughterhouse of John P. Squire and Company. So I just want to show you where I'm talking about real quick. By all accounts, strong stenches did abound in East Cambridge, which is the neighborhood we're looking at here. You had Squire and 8 other establishments in that area slaughtering hogs on the shores of Miller's River. And that's what I've circled with blue on the slide to make it easier to see. Boston is like that giant thumb across the water. Miller's River is also where these slaughterhouses dumped their waste and where the newly installed city sewers emptied out. So a pretty nasty body of water. On a July night in 1873, the stenches were so strong that they became visible. Houses blackened and silver tarnished overnight. Chemists explained that these changes were chemical reactions between the lead in paint and high concentrations of sulfuric gases in the air. The question that the board hoped to decide through its hearing is if Squire and Company was responsible for the smells. But Squire's lawyers were there to sow uncertainty about the existence of odors, about whether witnesses could identify and differentiate between the stinks, and about the odor's effects on health itself. So I've already told you about the board's hesitation to hear how women reacted to the odors. That hesitation further shaped the hearing by giving Squire's lawyers the perfect way to reframe the case. Instead of addressing the question they came there for, of whether the slaughterhouse released odors that were detrimental to health, the lawyers seized upon those concerns the board had about women's sensitivity and argued that overly sensitive noses should not decide the issue. This is what they said. So keen a perception is a misfortune and not a fault, but it is not a standard by which a case of this kind is to be judged. As Squire's lawyer continued, he explained that women and the upper classes were too sensitive. My idea is that the whole of Cambridge is not to be devoted to literature and residences. That's a dig at Harvard. But that part of it is to be devoted to commercial and manufacturing purposes, and those citizens whose nostrils are very sensitive will live upon the highlands and not upon the lowlands. In short, this lawyer argued that women and the upper class men had different senses and different healthfulness than those who worked in the slaughterhouses and nearby industries. But in the women's testimony, women explained that inhaling foul odors disrupted sleep, irritated throats, caused nausea and headaches. Certainly workers could talk about the same thing. Although physicians today would talk about these as a respiratory issue, physicians in the 19th century were talking about neurasthenia. Neurasthenia, I just want to remind you, referred to the physical and mental toll exacted by a modernizing culture that included both industrialization, things like those slaughterhouses, and women taking a greater role in society, say by testifying to the Board of Health. So to understand the board's hesitancy to listen to women's sensory knowledge and how a lawyer could say keen senses were effeminate, we need to consider and to rethink how physicians were diagnosing reactions to the changing urban environment. In 1881, George Miller Beard published a thorough account of neurasthenia and its many causes. He had been working on this for quite a while at this point, and the book is called American Nervousness. This text can be read as a criticism of modern industrial society. For instance, it calls out clocks, watches, and the telegraph for hastening the speed of business and harrying poor businessmen. In the same vein, the book talks about the toll that modern society's innovations were taking on the senses. Beard was not worried about odors. He noted there was no scientific proof that offensive odors were correlating with poor health. Noises, on the other hand, could have the same sort of negative effects on individuals that earlier generations had attributed to stenches. While most people could adjust to increasing noises and benumb their senses, others, Beard called them idiosyncratic, they would become more distressed as they were exposed to more and louder noises. So Beard explained that idiosyncratic cases were very much like allergies today, in that there was an irritant that only affected a select few, and those people would have their condition worsen if they were exposed to more irritants. The only solution for them is that the people who were afflicted should flee the irritant. So as he explained the many irritants that might cause neurasthenia in an idiosyncratic person, Beard identified specific groups of Americans who were especially susceptible to this ailment, to neurasthenia, and some people that he thought were impervious. Susceptible groups overlapped with common assumptions about sensitivity. The more sensitive, especially women, were likely to become neurasthenic when they were exposed to prolonged heat or cold, to rough cloth, to constant noise. Much of this susceptibility, Beard said, came from living for ideas and science, the height of modern civilization. And Beard used that same analysis to say that less civilized groups were insensitive to the irritants. And we should note, Beard was racist, right? So he's saying the sensory experiences of Native Americans, of African Americans, of Catholics, of the lower classes, those can all be dismissed because they don't really feel anything. Beard's ideas circulated widely, both in the medical profession and in the popular press. And so they were likely already lodged in the minds of the lawyers and the Board of Health physicians. When cross-examining women, lawyers for the slaughterhouse routinely asked about a particular symptom, sick headache. So I'm going to share one more image with you, and this is from Beard's book. What you're looking at is a chart of general nerve sensitiveness, and it starts at the bottom, right, with some low-level issues. I've highlighted sick headache is there, but what this is, as Beard presented it and everyone understood it was like an escalation that would lead you to insanity. You'll note that neurasthenia is towards the top of the chart. If you had sick headache, you were on your way there. So when lawyers asked the female witnesses about sick headache, they're setting up this argument. All 6 women denied the allegation, but they had already complained about headaches. And the lawyers were just changing what headaches meant. Headaches were no longer evidence that there was a harmful environment. Because of this idea of sick headache, they became proof that these were overly sensitive individuals who could not handle the smell. In essence, Squire's lawyers used the women's testimony to shift the hearing away from questions of public health toward weaker individuals who needed to relocate. Okay, so that leaves us with the question. Were women's senses weaker and more overwhelmed? Were women actually the weaker sex? Or did the Board of Health miss something here? I think they missed something because there's a lot of evidence that undermines the idea that women were categorically weaker, whether we talk about today or we're talking about the 19th century. As a historian, I'm going to keep us in the 19th century with just one example from Chicago, where tourists regularly visited the massive slaughtering operations of Union stockyards. They went there to see industrialization, to see the modern disassembly line in person. It was messy, it was smelly, and it was noisy. It often overwhelmed the senses of these visitors. One of them was Londoner William Hardman, who wrote about his visit. He thought that cattle slaughter was offensive enough to the eye and nostril, and he hated to even think about the thoroughly abominable, appalling, and asphyxiating stink of slaughtering hogs. But when Hardman wrote about his visit, he also wondered how his female travel companions could be unbothered by such horrendous sights and smells. Hardman recounted, among our party were some strong-minded ladies whose thirst for knowledge apparently overcame all other feelings, and who lingered so fondly among the horrors of the place that the weaker sex, in this case, the men, were in despair. I love that line, okay? Hardman is making a joke about sensory inversion when women could stomach the sights and the stenches that men, including him, could not. And that joke, much like the lawyer's mockery of the women's complaints, stopped them, right, from considering women's experiences, women's bodies, and women's health. This was and is a problem of our culture as much as a problem of our medicine. So moving forward, because I think about today too, I hope we can move away from jokes and respond in earnest when women and minorities, like those who first noticed the effects of poisonous water in Flint, Michigan, when they try to tell us about their health. Rather than dismissing these groups as too sensitive or as insensitive in the way that George Miller Beard did, I propose that we take seriously their complaints and that we interrogate the supposed hardiness of other individuals to identify how marginalized Americans have experienced, adapted to, and suffered from our rapidly changing environment. That's my introduction to 19th century stenches and laughing at women for you. I'm excited to answer any questions you have for me. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you very much. You can't hear it, but I assure you we're all applauding, even though I can hear the sound outside my windows here in Tulsa.
Wonderful. That's great.
It was a terrific talk. We're very grateful for that. I appreciate you, and I asked Melanie to keep it in a somewhat concise form so that we'd have ample time for conversation. I know Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and so we want to be aware of that as well. So at this point, I'm actually going to invite my colleague, Dr. Don James McLaughlin from the Department of English here at the University of Tulsa to sort of take over some Q&A, and he's going to engage in a brief chat himself with Melanie here, and then we'll proceed to sort of bring your questions into the mix as well. But I hope you'll join me now in welcoming Don James, who, as I said, is both a member of our faculty and one of our Courage Fellows this year. So Don James, I'll turn it over to you. In just a moment. There we go.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie. That was an incredible talk. And as someone who is especially interested in the intersection of public health and psychology, I really appreciated your talk for the way it bridges those subjects in a way that I hope is done more often in the future. I have a few questions. One thing I wanted to say is I see this toolkit in the back of your room. And one thing that I love about your work is that I think you think of public health as a toolkit. It represents this collection of resources that people can draw upon to make themselves known, to make their concerns known. So I thought it was just really appropriate, because that's something that I've appreciated about your work in the past is the way you provide a history of our public health toolkits in the 19th century and in ways that clearly resonate with the present. One of the things that you talk about in your work is common sense. Common sense, as we usually use this concept, refers to a baseline intelligence for presenting oneself as appropriately informed. I like the way that you use common sense in a slightly different valence, which has to do with the common sensory information that people can use to speak to one another and to lay claim to issues in the world that need to be solved. So I want to ask you a question about this usage of common sense. In public health, common sense can be a good. It can be a good if we know how to tap into instincts that reflect something that is genuinely going on in the world, something that genuinely needs to be fixed. Common sense can also potentially be a problem if it represents that which has already been accepted, and in doing so represents a hindrance to pursuing that which is not yet known. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you understand the relationship between common sense and public health, both in terms of what it can provide and the hindrances that it can present.
I think I'm unmuted now. I'm getting lots of like alerts from Zoom. So that is a fantastic question, Don James, and I'm so glad you asked it, because when I talk about common sense, I'm poking at a lot of things that we tend to not pay attention to because we think they're common sense, and so everyone knows it. One of the things that I think is so powerful and important is that we all have senses, right? And we all use senses. And in the 19th century, when people thought that smells, stenches would affect their health, the ways in which everyone could sense that were powerful and important, and they could bring people together, like at this hearing, but for the Board of Health. But the other thing with common sense is that it's actually not so common. We may think that we all sense things in the same way and we share a common attitude or a common way of being in society. It could be because we're all students at the same school, or we're all Americans, right? So we share a sensibility, but that's not true. And so that's one of the things I'm really excited about with this project, because I'm going back to some of the same sources and pointing out how there's a lot of different senses there, and the ways in which people are sensing things. I don't know that any of them are invalid, right? That's not a decision or an evaluation I can make as a historian 150 plus years later. But I can see how those things were either held up as trustworthy or completely dismissed. And I think that's really important for us in understanding how certain patterns got baked into our society and baked into our public health really early on, because I think those things are the hardest to shake. And so, Miller's River no longer exists. They filled it in at the end of the hearing, in case anyone was wondering. But you can't actually fill in a river. So now when we look at climate change maps, that area is going to be inundated with rising sea levels. And that's also going to have an effect on health. So I think getting in and really exploring the idea of common sense and what senses, whose senses were accepted as common. And what I'm really excited about in this project is to work on the senses of the people who were ignored, and see like what they were registering and how they tried, right, to bring that forward in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, if I could follow up on that last point. Another thing that I think is really cool about your book, Smell Detectives, is that you're interested in how miasma theory, which is now this debunked theory of disease,
It is
actually did give people a common language, a common vernacular for talking about public health and talking about environmental degradation. And as you show in that book, ironically, even though miasma was wrong, it did give people a pathway to representing real environmental distress, and therefore to advocate for policies that would answer that distress. Which brings us to this question of a public health vernacular. A public health vernacular represents another kind of commons, the possibility that our understanding of the things that make us well and the things that are potentially harmful, that we can use that language to again, petition for things that we need, for forms of change that would be salubrious. So I'm wondering if you have ideas about what you would like to see happen to an American public health vernacular today that you think would be beneficial for giving people a new language that would allow them to kind of represent themselves and represent their communities in a way that would be accessible broadly.
That's such a good question. I have so many ideas. So you'll just have to cut me off at a certain point. So the first thing I want to take up is the idea that miasma theory was wrong. Historians of medicine have been saying this, doctors have been saying this ever since the discovery of microbes and germs. And now that we're in this pandemic and we're increasingly aware that the coronavirus spreads through the air, a lot of people are like, oh, miasma's back. And I can clarify that miasma is not back. Because miasma was the idea that emanations from rotting matter, decomposing matter, that's what was causing illness. Now that idea is not so far off from the real thing. Germs, bacteria, those proliferate in rotting matter, right? So this is why we take the trash out every week. We don't want it to pile up and then have vermin spreading bacteria through our homes. So even though scientifically we know that 19th century Americans were wrong when they said that miasmas made them sick, we also know that they did a lot of things that were right because of this belief that they had. I think that's a really powerful and important thing for us to remember, right? 19th century Americans were not stupid. They had a very clear way of being in their environment and trying to protect themselves and remain safe in their environment. But there were a lot of things that were changing that were well outside of their control, including urbanization. So we have a lot of overcrowded spaces. We're talking about rapid industrialization that city services did not keep up with. So you have these huge slaughterhouses in the 19th century. Most people didn't have plumbing in their homes or sewers, you know, the things that we think of as being modern and being absolutely necessary. We're not all there yet. So there was a lot of rotting matter. In terms of how miasma worked as a public health vernacular, miasma had been around. It wasn't just a 19th century idea. It had been around for millennia, really, at that point. So it was hard, even if you weren't a scientist, not to know about it, right? Not to know that a bad air can make you sick and that there were certain things that you should do and certain things that you shouldn't do. Those things people learned so early that they felt like instinct. That's why I call them common sense, right? That they thought these were just common sense. Everyone knew. And in thinking about, right, how that vernacular works or how we could use a similar vernacular today, it's hard to say. In part because I think we're really aware of all the ways in which we do not have a shared vernacular. And when we say a shared vernacular, what we mean is like we don't have a common language that we all use, a certain terms or toolkit, if you want to look around my basement, that everyone understands in the same way. So a great example of this is the issue with vaccines, right? Lots of Americans understand that vaccines are important. They protect our health. They prevent diseases that used to kill tremendous numbers of people, often before they got to be 10, let alone in the prime of their lives. But we're also really aware because there's another group who's very vocal that there are people who don't believe in vaccines, that think vaccines are dangerous, vaccines are hurting their health. And when those things are presented in the news or on Facebook as if they're just the same, and you have to go to a fact checker site to find out more, that makes it a lot harder. And so in some ways, I think in the 19th century, it was easier to have a shared vernacular because the idea was so old, but also because the opportunities for communication were a lot more limited. That's not to say that 19th century Americans didn't talk to one another and spread rumors and spread misinformation. That happened a lot as well. But we have different conditions that make it hard now to have a common language in the same way that Americans did in the 19th century.
It's a great point. Thank you so much for that answer.
You're welcome.
Dr. Latham, you had a question about race. Did you want to jump in with that?
Yeah, and I'm happy to say the chat here is starting to fill up with all kinds of different questions, Melanie. So we'll have lots of different things coming to you here in a moment. But one of the things I think I asked early on here, I think at the very end, you suddenly expanded your talk from women to talk about all sort of marginalized groups. And I'm sort of, race is clearly a question I'm sure that you've at least looked at a little bit in relationship to this question. But the focus of your talk on neurasthenia made the focus really on gender and how neurasthenia could be used to sort of diagnose, as it were, or sort of transfer the sort of responsibility for these complaints onto gender and to sort of pathologize gender. So, but I wonder what role race played here. So, in particular, how did the attempts by Black men and women to testify about their health, how were they greeted in these kind of public forums, or were they even allowed to be heard at all? And what kind of strategies were used to short circuit or undermine their testimonies?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. And that's kind of the next place for my research to go. So my answers are really preliminary right now. One thing that I think is powerful in this idea of neurasthenia is that it's playing off a longstanding idea that women were the weaker sex, and suddenly that's being transferred into, now women are more sensitive, they can't handle it. At the same time, there's another really old idea, which is that other races don't feel things, they're insensible. And we probably know this best today when we think about African-American women and their postpartum mortality rates, which are shockingly high compared to the rest of American women. And a lot of that disparity comes from the fact that physicians still think that African-Americans have a much higher pain tolerance than the rest of us. That's an idea that goes back to slavery, to some of Thomas Jefferson's ramblings, where he thinks, just because he thinks it, that African Americans have thicker skin than the rest of us. And so those ideas of insensitivity also, I think, are wrapped up really importantly in this moment. The idea that a certain group of people is insensitive means you don't even ask, right? Public health reformers don't even ask if they also are bothered by the odors in their neighborhoods. So there's a lot of literature in history of the census that essentially is just about upper class people, right? Whether we're talking about the US or we're talking about in Europe. But if we dig deeper, there is also evidence that the people who were being ignored, working class, immigrants, African Americans, that they all were also experiencing these problems. They just had a trouble finding out how to articulate them. So when we look at something like what Jane Addams was doing in the South Side of Chicago, she's working with immigrant women. Southern European women were not considered white in the late 19th century, so they also were supposed to be coarser, and they could tolerate a lot of conditions that, upper class white women couldn't. Jane Addams and Mary McDowell, who was pushing for garbage collection, she's known as the garbage lady, they were not necessarily leading the charge on this front. But the women who came to the settlement house brought issues that they were experiencing that they could articulate. right? To Adams and to McDowell. And so what we have, like when we look at the settlement house movement is, yeah, we have white women moving into marginal neighborhoods and trying to do good, but they often are amplifying voices that weren't being heard in other venues. And so I think there's a lot for us to dig into if we can push past the idea, right, that different groups tolerate things in different ways and actually get down on the ground. The challenge for me is I need to find more sources because African-American women are not going to be at public health hearings. And this health hearing that I talked about tonight, they tried to bring in some of Squire's employees who were all recent immigrants from Poland. But they ran into a problem, which is that they were sick. And so that I think is deeply ironic and worth thinking about.
Yeah. Thank you. We have another question from Jen Latham. Jen asks, do you see, and if so, could you elaborate on, any similarities between disregard for women's experiences of stenches and public health hazards and contemporary disregard for or minimization of testimony of women like Christine Blasey Ford about sexual assault and other physical and mental violations?
That is a really great question. I hadn't actually thought about that connection. I've been really focused on how environmental racism got baked into public health early on. And so I haven't looked at a lot of the accounts of sexual assault. But we do see a lot of the same kind of mechanisms happening, especially when we go back to that question of laughing at the women who are testifying. Sometimes laughter is coming just from discomfort, but it can be turned really quickly. And I think we saw that, right, in the testimony that Christine Blasey Ford gave, and then the sort of public reaction about and against what she had to say, even though she said it really well. And she relied on psychology, which she's trained in order to explain exactly what the long-term effects of such an experience are. So yeah, we're wandering a little further afield, but I think the cultural bit, which is what I want to draw our attention to, and think about how our wider culture affects the ways in which we react when people bring forward painful testimony, especially testimonies of physical torment. There's a continuum there that the response to survivors' accounts of sexual abuse, of domestic abuse, also very much fits into. So I will keep thinking about that as I move forward. Thank you so much for the question.
This kind of builds a little bit on this question. Cooper has a question about whether forms of common sense do develop across gendered lines for one reason or another. And so I think the follow-up question might be, are there forms of intelligence that women have or that various minorities have that come from a common sensory come from common sensory information that is built through unique forms of experience?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. And this is like one of those places where we want to be very careful not to like suddenly essentialize that everyone in these groups experience the exact same thing in the exact same way, because of course, individuality is still there. And, you know, we're talking in kind of really large terms right now. So I think intelligence is a really great word for this, but the one that I often use is tacit knowledge. And what tacit knowledge refers to is, you know, knowledge that people have, things that people know how to do, they know what to do, but they don't necessarily have the language to explain how they know, or even to explain to you how to do it. So think about when you learn to ride a bike. I cannot teach someone else how to ride a bike. I like, it just, It's so obvious and it's so easy. That is an example of tacit knowledge, right? It's completely ingrained in me. At this point, I can get on a bike again. I actually don't remember the last time I was on a bike, so this would be a good challenge, actually. And I'll be able to ride it. But if I had to turn around and explain to someone what to do, I would really bumble through that. That's tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge is knowledge that we acquire in a lot of different ways, but often it's very early in our lifetimes. So yes, different groups have different tacit knowledge because there are different skills that they're passing from parents to children. I grew up on a farm. I have a lot of skills that I do not use in my day-to-day work as a professor, but there are also skills that I imagine a lot of other people do not have, because your parents certainly didn't have to teach you, right, how not to get kicked by a horse. That is a really important common knowledge, and it used to be far more common when more Americans lived and worked with horses. And so that's where I think we can see different knowledges not developing, but being passed, right, from generation to generation. Print culture really intervenes in this, especially when there were high literacy rates, because it tries to do something that's impossible with tacit knowledge, right? It tries to write it down. That's what Catherine Beecher was doing when she wrote How to Take Care of the House. She was trying to instruct women who hadn't had the same experiences she had on how they could better do things. And she was incorporating a lot of science, but putting it into vernacular, right? Easily understood terms that other women could get. And so that's another way that you could pick it up, right? I've picked up a lot of skills since I moved away from the farm that I use in my day-to-day life that didn't come from my parents. There are lots of different ways that you can get tacit knowledge, but that also means that we can't, you know, encounter a person, whether that's out on the street today or in a hearing in the 1870s, and know exactly what their common sense was, because we can identify what gender, what race, you know, what religion they had, right? And so that's where I want to like kind of poke some holes in that idea, even though I think it's a really powerful and good idea, right? That there are specific knowledges within certain groups that are so widespread as to be common sense of that group. Yeah.
Beautiful answer. Thank you. And it's changing the way I think about that type of question. One of a wonderful student of mine is in the chat box and an English major, Angela Ray. She asks, do you think miasma theory could act as an active way that would educate modern society about how to interact with healthcare? I was thinking, just to kind of extend another question from this one, do you want to talk more about ventilation and how our understanding of ventilation has changed over time, and some interesting things that you think are going on today about how ventilation is interacting with the contemporary pandemic?
100%. I am here to talk to you about ventilation and tell you all to open your windows. Damn it. So this is like such an important question, like whether or not we could use miasma theory today now that it's been debunked. And I don't know that we can. But we can use the tactics that people use to protect themselves against miasma theory. And so ventilation was a really important tactic, but it's not because of miasma theory that ventilation came into existence. In the late 18th century, early 19th century, scientists, physicians were doing experiments, and they learned about respiration, breathing, how it works, what it does in the body. And that had just been a mystery up until now. Going back into the ancient world, people understood that the air was important. They knew that there were places that you would go, like down into a mine, and that it could be very dangerous. You might not be able to breathe. They knew this because they sent canaries, like actual canaries, into the mine. And if they stopped singing, well, don't go down there. So they knew the air was really important, but it isn't until the understanding of a better understanding of what happens when you breathe came into existence, that people began to really focus on ventilation. They had some confused ideas. So first of all, they thought when we inhale oxygen, that is a life-giving force that our bodies need. And then we exhale something that's poison. And I suppose that's true, right? If you're in a room that only has carbon dioxide, that would not be a good place to breathe. But this is why they were so concerned about ventilation. They were insistent that you had to change the air in the room. Otherwise, our exhalations would build up to the point that people would lose consciousness, people would become sick, people would suffocate, right, on the air they were breathing. And there were some pretty horrible examples of, for example, a ship that was going through a storm. It had lots of immigrants in the hold. In order to keep them dry, the sailors tacked tarps over all the openings on the deck. And when they got out of the storm, they removed those tarps to find out that most of the people had died because they didn't have air. So that's a horrific story that traveled really far throughout society as like, you know, you have to open the windows. And this is where the enthusiasm for ventilation came from. Now, their misunderstanding about respiration, right, that the air we exhale is dangerous. There was a ventilation expert by the name of Lewis Leeds who said, man's breath is his own worst enemy. Now there's a line, right? That is knowledge that is useful for us today, as we know that people who have been exposed to the coronavirus, whether they test positive or not, whether they're showing symptoms or not, every time they breathe, they're expelling droplets, right, with their air. And it's even worse if they cough or spit or yell, which is why I'm talking to you through a computer screen tonight. It's better for all of us. That is knowledge that we could use, because that is a very clear, you know, we can't let it build up in our rooms, right? If you're going to class, pay attention to how your building is ventilated, right? Can you open windows? Over the course of the 20th century, we've developed air conditioning and heating systems, and a lot of those things, in order to be energy efficient, have sealed buildings off from the external environment. So you have to pay attention to how the air that you're breathing is coming to you. And that's something that fits in with 19th century ideas. I feel like I wandered a little far from the original question, and with my passion for ventilation, open windows, it's a thing, it's good. Trust me, even in the winter, it won't kill you. But yeah, I hope that speaks to the original question. And if not, please say it again for me.
Thank you. So there's another question from Matt Drever, who asks, you talked about the intersection between public health as well as the way that racism and sexism undermined an adequate understanding of public health. Today, we are too challenged with safe labor practices in a pandemic, even as we are confronted with our continued failure to treat and protect minority populations. What can we learn from the 19th century that we might apply today?
I think we should learn from their failures, right? So in the 19th century, even though they create the idea of public health, they put public health into practice, they often failed to see it through, right? So there's this hearing, it goes on for 14 days. It's pretty clear that Squire's slaughterhouse is sending out some nasty stenches and other things into the local environment. But the Board of Health doesn't rule against him, right? There's this uncertainty that has been introduced by the end of the hearing that maybe it's not Squire, maybe it's one of the other 8 slaughterhouses that really is producing the stench. And so that like plausible deniability, that window that allowed Squire to say, it might not be me, it's my neighbor, actually, I've been there. That uncertainty bit, right, of having to be absolutely certain before you could do something, that's a problem we still have today, right? And often the people who exploit our uncertainty about something are large businesses, because they want to be open, because they want to keep making money. I mean, this is what businesses do. And often the cost of doing that, they're like, well, we're not sure yet. I mean, we see this problem with climate change as well as the question of essential workers during the pandemic. And so if we could learn something from the 19th century, I'd like us to learn to be better, to act more quickly. I hope you'll spread that message, because I haven't gotten it across to enough people yet. But I think that's the thing that we really need to learn, to not wait for all the evidence, but in fact, act when we're fairly sure, even if it's not 100% certain.
I have a final question to build on that last point. One thing that I think is wonderful, even poetic about this talk, is that it's about listening. That's kind of the object of analysis. And it's about people who weren't listened to, even though they had some really important information to share. What's poetic about the talk then is that the method has a relationship with the object. Part of the method of this talk is to listen to these historical interlocutors who were not listened to in their own time. And they find a listener in you. And now, because you've given this talk, they find listeners in all of us. And I think there's something really important about that resonates with everything that's going on today. So I'd like to ask a final question about your own methods in doing these histories. How do you cultivate a state of being attuned to moments in archival research that require a special openness to listening?
That is such a good question. And it cuts at the heart of what all of us are trying to do as students and as scholars, and hopefully just as people in the world, right? I think one of the things that I learned really early on was that everyone has a rationality. And even if I do not share their rationality, like there are lots of people that I've studied who I do not agree with. I need to understand it. I need to do the work to understand why people think the things that they do, and where that knowledge came from. The other thing that I have to do every time I go into 19th century sources is I have to let them teach me, right? Not assume that I know more because I'm living in 2020, a wonderful time to be alive. But actually, read what they're trying to say. Lots of times I'll read things that I really don't agree with. In case it hasn't been clear, I do not think women are the weaker sex. Never were, never will be. But I have to understand, and this is what I'm trying to do, where does that idea come from? Why does it have so much power over so many people? And how does it get built in, right? It's just as a course into everything else. So, I mean, listening is really the right thing. The other thing that I recommend to all of you is rereading. So what I've shared with you tonight is something that I discovered when Don James and I were in Massachusetts together many years ago. I can't remember now how many. And at the time, I read this 600 pages of people talking about how bad it smelled. And I was like, ooh, fascinating. But I didn't see this moment where they shut down the women who were trying to speak. And then I did see the moment and I thought, oh, it's late 19th century. It's not okay for women to be in a courtroom. It's, uncomfortable, male doctors, women with their weird body parts. It's very much a 19th century idea, right? And earlier that women had weird body parts. So I kept moving past it. And I think now when I come back and I look at it and I see the way in which they're emphasizing sensitivity, overly sensitive noses. Do you have sick headache? There's actually something really specific that happens that stopped the Board of Health from listening, but also for us in trying to understand the 19th century limits what we can hear, because there were more women who had things to say and they didn't get to do it. So it's not written in my sources and it's a lot harder to find. And that takes more listening, not less.
Terrific. Well, I think I'm going to step in here because that's actually a lovely statement, I think, and to end the talk, and a lovely way to bring this evening together. So I hope you all join me first in thanking Don James, who helped moderate the Q&A session here. It's been terrific to have him, and it's terrific to have him as a fellow of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities this year. As Don James said in his question to you, I want to thank you for giving us an opportunity, not just to hear your talk and to hear your research, but to give us a moment and a space to think about hearing and listening to others. It's one of the most important things that the humanities can offer as a sort of mode of knowing in the world, of understanding what the humanities are for, and what kind of urgent work they allow us to do is precisely to listen to others, to understand, is I think I don't want to quite butcher your phrase here, that others have rationalities that we may not agree with or understand, but it's important to hear them and to debate them and bring them out into the open rather than to simply dismiss them or pathologize them. So I'm grateful to you, Melanie, for giving us a chance to listen to history and in fact to listen to each other this night as well. So thank you for this terrific talk. If you turn on your chat window, I know you've got it closed, so you wouldn't be distracted, but it's filled with people saying thank you as well. So I offer my applause to stand in for the applause of everyone else who is here this evening. It was a pleasure to have you here, and I hope we'll be able to bring you to the University of Tulsa in person sometime. So thank you. And in the meantime, I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening as well. It was a pleasure to welcome you. I hope you'll join us next week when we bring Nick Estes to the Humanities Center. And in the meantime, I hope you'll all take care of yourselves and take care of our community. Thank you and good night.